I just want to do a very quick overview of today's reading assignment. You'll be reading chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1 deals with North America before the arrival of all the Europeans. This map gives you a very general overview of all the different peoples, all with different languages and traditions. It was quite a diverse place with possibly as many as 20 million people, including Central America. We really just don't have great numbers. Population collapse began almost immediately upon contact with Europeans as a result of diseases to which the natives didn't have immunities as strong as the Europeans. Civilization, which means the building of cities and agriculture-based societies, complex societies, first began in the Americas here in Central America with the Olmec people, probably 2 to 1,000 years before Christ, or before the Common Era, as your book puts it. That would spread. I mean, we have civilization spreading into Mexico and into the Yucatan. This is going to be Mayan area, eventually the Aztecs, which come very late, but they'll be occupying this area when the Spanish arrive. This is a famous Olmec head. They crafted these giant basalt monuments of some kind. This is Chichen Itza, the famous Mayan temple, or pyramid, I should say. This is the site of modern-day Mexico City, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, that would be in the early 1500s conquered by Cortez for the Spanish crown. Of course, civilization and agriculture spread. It spread north to the Four Corners region. We used to call the people there the Anasazi. We prefer the term ancestral pueblo today. They are, you hopefully, if you haven't yet, you can visit someday some of the dwellings that are still around at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Those were some of the largest buildings in the Americas until close to the 20th century. In terms of the amount of people that were housed in those housing units. People around modern-day Phoenix who developed agriculture in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, or the Hohokam. Your book talks about them a bit. And then there were other cliff-dwelling peoples of New Mexico. And then across North America in the southeast into the northeast and Midwest of the continent, the broadly known Mississippian people who used to be called mound builders. They built these massive mound structures around which cities developed. Probably the largest of these was at Cahokia, which is basically at modern-day St. Louis, just across the river from St. Louis. A city that housed maybe as many as 30,000 people. Again, based on agriculture. These societies, we believe, collapsed prior to the arrival of Europeans, or were sort of in the process of collapsing upon the arrival of Europeans. So we don't really have great records as to who these folks were and what happened to them. One key about the Americas is you can see all of these food items which are incredibly important today across the world, not just in any one part of the world, but these are crops that are vital to life all over the world, human life and animal life for that matter. And they were all developed first here in the Americas by Native Americans who were domesticating crops. And this exchange between Old World and New World becomes known as the Columbian Exchange for Christopher Columbus. And you can see all of these items that were not heard of before in the old country, really important. Beans, corn, tomato, potatoes, peanuts, tobacco is a big one. So all of these are now being introduced into Europe. Meanwhile, all of these things that had never been seen in the Americas before, coffee, types of fruits, the olive, and maybe most significantly all these diseases, which will have profound effects on the native populations of the Americas. These are coming in, and what's going to happen is massive amounts of agricultural developments in the Americas, but also new crops in Europe that are going to increase populations of Europe, even as they're developing wealth by growing mainly sugarcane, but also coffee and some of these other crops in the Americas. So it's essentially a transformation that's still continuing today. And then into chapter 2, you're going to come across the original the age of exploration, which begins with the Portuguese in the 1400s. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get to India and beyond here to China to access all the goods, all the things people want from China to, increase wealth. As they do so, they're trying to get around Africa. And that's tough because getting around this southern tip of Africa is actually quite a feat and requires a lot of new technologies when it comes to ship technology. As they're doing this, they're also developing colonies in the Canary Islands and the Cape Verde Islands and Sao Tome. And these are actually going to be where the first sugar plantations develop. And the labor force for those sugar plantations are going to be enslaved Africans. So this is already happening before the Americas are colonized. We have a system in place of sugar plantations staffed by enslaved Africans. That's exactly what's going to happen in the Americas. These slaves typically came from Central Africa and were marched to the coast where they were sold to Portuguese, and they are led to the coast in these lines that we call coffles, where they were chained together and forced on this march by their fellow Africans to be sold on the coast to Portuguese. It's not the Europeans in the heartland of Africa stealing Africans and enslaving them. It's Africans kidnapping other Africans and then selling those captives to the Europeans as slaves. Then along comes this guy, Christopher Columbus, who has an idea of how to get to China and India without going around the tip of Africa, and his plan is to sail west. Everyone at the time knew the world was round. It's a misnomer that he somehow was challenging the prevailing thought. The world, everyone knows the world is round today. Everyone knew it then. Christopher Columbus just miscalculated the size of the world. He thought he'd be arriving in Asia. Instead, he was arriving in the Caribbean Sea. And so this is his first journey made in 1492. He bumps into this first land here in what's the Bahamas. He thinks he's reached Asia. In fact, he'll come back a few times and still think he's reached Asia. And in fact, he dies insisting that he's reached Asia. So because he thinks he's found some islands off the coast of Japan near the Indies, he calls the people he finds Indians. There's his future journeys. Notice he never actually stepped foot in what is now the United States of America. What he'll do is he'll lay claim to everything he finds, including the north coast of Cuba, and then he'll establish the first Spanish colony on Hispaniola. And then here's some of his other journeys. He did explore around Central America, but never made it to what is now the United States of America. And then really quickly, here is population collapse. This is specifically for Mexico. So smallpox, some sort of unknown influenza, another appearance of that same influenza, and within, less than 100 years, the population collapse in Mexico is over 80%, somewhere around 90%. Of the population is now gone because of the introduction of these new diseases. And that was fairly common experience for Native American populations, as you'll read. And then here are all the Spanish explorations of North America you'll be reading about. And then here are some of the world trade patterns that come out of this period of colonization. And part of that trade is what's known as the Middle Passage, the journey made by slaves from Africa to the Americas. Okay, that'll set you up hopefully for the reading this week.